Have you wondered why some people are able to navigate trauma more effectively than others? In the world we live today, parents are dealing with a variety of tough challenges with their kids, especially when it comes to helping their kids navigate unsettling global events and the constant flow of news and social media. So naturally, raising resilient kids is understandably top of mind for parents. Well, today we are joined by Dr. Jonathan DePierro, a clinical psychologist and expert in psychological resilience and the treatment of trauma-related mental health conditions. Dr. DePierro co-authored Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges, which has been updated for a post-COVID world. Dr. DePierro is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and Associate Director of Mount Sinai's Center for Stress, Resilience, and Personal Growth. His book covers the rapidly emerging scientific research behind what makes some of us able to navigate trauma more effectively than others. Now, we're going to be diving into their discoveries, sharing personal stories, and providing practical advice on how parents can guide their kids into building resilience during these very, very tough times. Dr. DePierro, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a very loaded topic. Your book has been out for a while. This is edition number 3. Thank you for writing the 3rd edition. And I understand that you're making it more accessible to the public, less academic, which is really important because over these months with war erupting in the Middle East, and now we've got school shootings and we've got public shootings, parents are scared and they want to know, how do I help my kids navigate a world that is dangerous and very frightening? So you write about resilience and you write about it from a personal experience. Talk about what resilience is all about. Is it just being sort of taking a deep breath and toughening it out? What is resilience?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And it's a question that scientists have been thinking about for a really long time. The way we think about resilience is your ability to adapt, recover, and grow from life's challenges. So it's a pretty broad definition, and there's a lot in there. We've done a lot of research, and others have done research too, on looking at what supports resilience in difficult times. This could be the global conflicts that we see now. It could be after 9/11. It could have been during the worst of the pandemic. We know there's a number of things that help people, and they all have biological underpinnings in the brain and in the body. So things like social support, having role models, engaging in some physical exercise, thinking flexibly about the challenges that you face, being optimistic. Those are just some of the things that we have found support people's resilience in difficult times. And so the book delves into those factors and many more. And one of the things that I also want to emphasize is that in our understanding, resilience and distress can go together. There's global events that are happening now that are extremely traumatic and uncertain and anxiety-inducing. You can see resilience, and I'm sure your listeners see it in themselves. Everyone's got strengths, and those strengths exist at the same time as distress exists. Those two things can be both true.
That's interesting because when you feel stressed, you don't feel resilient. You feel frightened. Gee whiz, what if this changes me forever? Gee whiz, what if this trauma changes my kids forever and they can't get past it? And I think that every parent worries about that when their kids are going through a traumatic experience, those kids are going to get stuck and life is going to be awful for them. So you were bullied as a child, and your co-authors of the book also had their traumatic experiences. So knowing what trauma is like as a child, how did you become resilient, and how did your colleagues become resilient through your stresses?
That's a really good question. And that's right. In the book, I touch on this a bit. I'm happy to share more now. When I was in elementary school and in middle school, I was pretty bookish, and a lot of my peers were very much into sports. I wasn't. I didn't see myself as coordinated or particularly athletic. And I was ostracized. There was a lot of emotional abuse. There was a lot of bullying, broadly speaking. There were incidents where I was physically attacked at school, and transferred schools a lot, I think, trying to escape some of what was happening. But kids, those things, bullying happens no matter what school you're in. So that didn't really change the situation. There are a few, I think, saving graces for me that really inform how I think about resilience. And the first saving grace that I would say is role models. So I had grandparents in particular come to mind as really stable figures in my life for 5 or 6 years in middle school and elementary school. When I was being bullied, I spent every weekend with my maternal grandparents, and they were incredibly supportive. It was a nice respite. They were safe. They were encouraging me. My grandfather was very much into like mechanical things and carpentry, and I learned a lot about those things and felt really competent in like taking things apart and putting things back together, and it built me back up again. My other grandfather on my father's side was at the time a hospital leader, leader of a health system, and from him I learned the importance of altruism and giving of your time. He always had food in his trunk to give out to people who didn't have. He did a lot of helping people who've been through hardships get through school and donating money to support them and giving of his time emotionally. So role models were exceptionally important for me. And those were the stable presence in my life during a period of uncertainty. So I knew that I could always go to them and my parents too for support during this time when I wasn't getting that social reinforcement and support and love in my peer group. So that was really important.
So what you're talking about is they gave you the love and support that was taken away at school. So do you think that compensated adequately? Because, being bullied at school and being torn apart by your peers is very, very painful. But then you had the opportunity for your family, close family, to say, no, 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 that's not who you are. That's not what life is all about. Did that change your ability to handle the bullying at school, or did it just give you the ability to survive it?
I think at the time, as I was a kid, kids' brains are different than adult brains. I think at the time, I would, looking back, say that it helped me survive it. And it certainly had an impact at the time. I can probably say with certainty that I was a depressed kid. I was withdrawn. I was quiet. I probably wasn't concentrating as well as I could in school, although I did well overall eventually. So it definitely had an impact on me. But I want to make clear a few things that even just one role model or one friend or one person that's a safe haven can go a long way in the midst of situations like bullying. And of course, these events leave a mark and can leave an impact. I think my self-confidence was shaken for a while. But in my business as a clinical psychologist, I tend not to see traumas as events that necessarily have to leave a lasting, permanent scar on the individual psyche. I'm in the business of helping people work through those events so that they're one thing that happened to them, but not the defining thing that happened to them. So yes, I talk about myself as someone who went through bullying, but that's not what defines me.
Wow. I mean, that's wonderful. So what you're saying is when you have a traumatic event like bullying, you can heal from it, you can close it and put it in the past. It doesn't need to affect your present life as an adult. Is that correct? If I'm hearing
That's
it right? Okay.
That's right. And there's I think from Stoic philosophy, a saying that's maybe easier said than done, but something like, we can't control what happens to us, but we can control if we're defined by them. We can control how we respond to them.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you said earlier, our brains are wired very differently from kids. And you talk about 10 core principles that resilient individuals share. Now, it seems to me that the core principles are responses that we can use or things operating in our lives that can help us get past the trauma. Is it safe to say that kids can utilize those too, facing their fears, for instance, or is it different from them? And
Right. So I would say, again, not only are kids different than adults, but the developmental stages are different. Now, do I think that a child or an adolescent who is 18 or 19 can do many of these things on their own as an adult can potentially? Sure. But there is a very important role of parents or other caretakers in the equation of providing an example or teaching these skills to their kids who then can ultimately do these on their own. But even there's a Thomas Merton book that's aptly named No Man is an Island. Even adults need support in their lives. My goal of the book, our goal of the book, is to not say, here are these 10 factors and you're good. Do these all 10 on your own and everything will be fine. No, you need to be in a context and in an environment that will support you in doing these things, and that you have to be in a community that believes in these principles together for them to be most successful. So it's never really an individual out of context, but particularly so for kids, right? The kids are in some ways dependent on their environment to support them in their learning and their personal growth and their emotion regulation. And some kids struggle in that sphere and need more support. Some kids are really dysregulated, might have ADHD, and need more support and structure. And other kids with even minimal support can take these things and run with them. There are kids that, for example, take sports on at a very early age, and it becomes something that they see as confidence boosting and stress relieving, well into adulthood.
Mm-hmm. And they may be doing it and not realizing it, realize that they're reducing their stress. So I'm just going to quickly go through the 10 principles. I don't like to go quickly. I'd like to spend a show doing, on each principle. First, confront your fears. Maintain an optimistic but realistic outlook. People sought, accepted, and provided social support. Very important for parents to do. Imitated sturdy role models. Relied on an inner moral compass. Turned to religious or spiritual practices. Attended to their health and well-being. Remained curious, pushing themselves to learn new things. Approached problems with flexibility and at times acceptance. And then 10, found meaning and growth during and after their traumatic experiences. Now, as I read those 10, it seems clean, straightforward, easy. But then I go, I don't know. Okay, confront your fears. So I'm a parent. I have a 10-year-old who is listening to the news. They hear about shooting in Lewiston, Maine, and they're afraid. How do I help my child confront their fears and at the same time confronting my own fears? So walk us through principle number 1, please.
Yeah, and certainly these tragic events like the school shootings happen, and these are delicate because they occur. There is a low likelihood of them happening in any individual child's school. Mm-hmm. So that's something that is important. So like challenging the fear is, like, for example, people who are afraid of flying on airplanes think that they invariably will get on the airplane and will crash. Turns out they are infinitely more likely to die in a car crash than a plane crash. And so challenging the prevalence of that can be a little bit helpful in sort of reframing. The biggest advice I would give to parents about this and other events is to limit exposure. The more that the parent is regulated and is managing their fears, the better off the child is going to be. Yeah. So having your favorite news station broadcasting in the background all day or all night or all morning as you're getting ready, and it's bad news after bad news may not be the most healthy thing that you can do. So
For
limiting it, yeah,
for yourself and
yeah,
your kids,
that's right.
please. You
Mhm.
know, parents will let the kids see these images over and over and over and over. They're I can't even see them. And you know, and I think that when we allow our kids to see that, um, in a child's mind, they begin to believe they're much more prevalent than they really are. Okay, this shooter came out of this bowling alley. And she was, gee whiz, I can't go to my bowling alley now too. So I love that you talk about keeping it realistic and saying, no, wait a minute. What are the chances this will happen to me? Of course it could. But then also cut it off. You know, don't subject your child and yourself to re-traumatizing yourself over and over. So I love that you say that. You talk about maintaining an optimistic outlook. So how do you stay optimistic when I'm assuming our audience listens to a lot of news and feels very discouraged. So, how do you maintain an optimistic outlook when you are so afraid of what's going on around you in the world?
I think one of the key principles there is focusing on what's within your scope of control. A lot of people who are pessimistic get bogged down in ideas, news, what if situations that they can never answer and are way outside their scope of control and their influence. And they lose sight of what's right in front of them right now. They lose sight of the fact that, for example, in this moment, right now, as people are listening, most people listening are actually safe.
Mm-hmm.
Some people
Right.
may not be. Some people might be in domestic violence situations. Some people might be in conflict zones, depending on where they're listening. They might have just experienced one of these national tragedies. Most people are safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you lose sight of that if you watch the news or scroll on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok for 5 or 6 hours out of the day. It can make you feel yourself personally very unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
And there are good reasons to feel unsafe, I think, for some people. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that most people are physically safe at the moment.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And it's intriguing to me why people watch trauma over and over and over. And you wonder if there's a sense, well, if I watch it enough, then I can figure out how to keep it from happening in my life. Maybe we can gain some control, but that doesn't happen. And so I love that you talk about, you know, the realism and then and then staying optimistic. And then of course social support. So if a parent needs to stay optimistic and unafraid, they need social support, friends, family, or something in order to give it to their kids. Is that fair?
That's right. I think the most important thing that parents can do to support their kids' resilience is to make sure they're taking care of themselves. I know
Mhm,
it's hard for a parent to say, oh, wait, I need to do more. You're telling me I need to do more.
mhm,
But as you said, there are things that are in your life that you're probably already doing, right? Parents might have friend groups based on their child's play dates or sports teams, connecting to those folks, building up relationships with people who you feel safe with and can support you, family members, cousins, work colleagues. The more you can strengthen your network of supports and have somebody who's clearly in your corner
mhm.
on a given day, on your worst day, the better off you're going to be to support your child. And certainly, it goes maybe without saying, but as a clinical psychologist, there's a lot of anxiety, sadness in the world. It's very important that parents, if they feel overwhelmed, that they can't handle things on their own, to seek appropriate mental health support, however they can access it, or even going to talk to their primary doctor, or, primary care provider or physician about it, so that they can be in a better, have better resources and be in a better space to support their kids going through something difficult.
Mhm. You know, I don't know if you've seen this in your practice, but this is my personal anecdotal um, experience. A lot of women, um, even really healthy women, tend to gravitate towards relationships with other women that drain them. And as I hear you talking about leaning on friends for support, I think it's important for people, men and women, to have relationships with other people that are optimistic, that help them stay healthy, that don't always drain them and make them feel worse. Sometimes I hear women get together and all they do is sort of feed on one another's fears. And, what if this and what if this? And there's no conclusion. So I would just encourage people, parents out there, to make sure you're around people, peers who are encouraging you, helping you, who are also optimistic as well. You talk about staying curious in when you're learning to be resilient. What do you mean by that?
That means challenging your brain. There's the old adage, use it or lose it.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to brain function, maybe it's not exactly that cut and dry, but people who are resilient challenge themselves intellectually. They take up hobbies or things that they might not have any skill whatsoever in, and start from the very beginning. For me, this was driving. As a native New Yorker, it was only last year, in my mid-30s, that I learned how to drive. And it's been a humbling and incredibly useful experience for my own personal growth, to navigate the uncertainties of learning how to drive and then getting out on the road and going 50 miles an hour. That's a great anxiety tolerance exercise for me. But pushing myself to do that was really important for me. And so looking for opportunities to grow as a person, to stay engaged, to use your brain. My wife and I do the crossword puzzle every night. We've done it for 310 consecutive nights.
Wow.
She travels internationally. I travel sometimes, and we always connect and do the crossword.
Do you do the New York Times crossword puzzles?
We do. We do.
You're brilliant. I gave up on that a long time ago.
We look at the clues. We look at the clues sometimes, but we're getting better at the common ones. And there are things that you can do in your day that challenge yourself in this way. You want to, in some ways, I think it's too simplified, but build up your brain like a muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Our colleague, or my co-author, Dennis Charney and Steve Southwick, interviewed Vietnam War POWs. And essentially this book, the first edition, started with their interviews of these, they were all men who had been in solitary confinement in POW camps for up to 6 or 7 years. And they started the work on resilience by simply asking them, how did you get through it? And curiosity comes up in many of the stories, or mental fitness comes up in many of the stories. For example, one of the POWs remembered all of the names of his all the prisoners he was with, all of the service members that were in his camp, to the tune of a nursery rhyme. So he's humming to himself as he was in the POW camp, while memorizing all of everybody's names. So when he got released, he could say, okay, this person is still there, this person got out, and so on. So he built up his working memory by doing this, and it helped him stay sane, frankly, and it helped his buddies because he was able to report back, who was there and who wasn't. And another POW built an entire house in his mind.
Wow.
Planned what it would look like in his mind while he was in the POW camp, and then ended up building the house when he got out. But using that capacity, because it, especially things, as extreme as solitary confinement, you can get absorbed by it very, very easily, and the hopelessness of it. But this gives some hope, and it gives some sense of agency. Like, there are some things I could still control. This comes in part from our, there's early work. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist and psychiatrist during.
Wasn't he?
He was in a concentration camp, and he wrote entire books in his mind while he was there, and really worked on the mental framework and focusing on what he could control, which is his perspective and his outlook, and not the situation. And this is what these guys did, but this is just a general good principle. People who are curious, veterans who endures high levels of curiosity, do better emotionally over time in our research.
Is this is this a trait you're born with, or is this something that you can teach to your kids or yourself?
Yeah, so just like everything else in life, there is a genetic component to resilience. And we know that there are people who seem to be born resilient. Maybe it's not that simple, but a lot of what we write about, almost all of it, every chapter is woven into it things that you can boost on your own or with the support of a therapist or a mentor or peer. So many of these things are imminently teachable. And so the way we think about resilience is that it's a moment by moment thing. It requires investment, it requires time. And just like you would be learning a new language, there are ways that you could challenge yourself so that you have a toolbox when you face big things in your life or when you face small things. There are, for example, people who get major medical diagnoses like heart failure or cancer who withdraw into themselves, and that's their response. And they withdraw socially. They become very hopeless. They think that there's nothing they can do. Their life is over. And that might not actually be the reflection of reality. And there are other folks, as an example, my co-author, Steve Southwick, battled prostate cancer for 5 years before passing away last year. And the last chapter of the book is devoted to him. It's his journals of how he was trying to be resilient through his cancer battle. He is a very good example of facing a challenge and doubling down on what is most important to him. So he was retired, he retired early on in his illness, but he continued to write, to consult, to have meetings with colleagues, to put out papers. He invested in his personal relationships. He was writing in the ICU up until his final week, leaving me voice notes and handwritten records, because this was his meaning and purpose. He never lost sight of his meaning and purpose.
Yeah. Is there a role that denial plays? I'm thinking in particular of people who go through severe trauma, like concentration camps, like the Vietnamese men that you worked with, where the trauma is so overwhelming, they dissociate. And I mean, we know that happens. Is that healthy or unhealthy?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And it is common when you're going through something. You can think of something like a car accident. There are people who are awake and alert following a car accident, but had sort of go numb in their body, or they feel like they're checked out or watching it in slow motion from a distance, or that they're in a movie and it's not really happening to them, or they're having an out of body experience. That's called dissociation. And that is, in some ways, you could think about it as your brain's way of protecting itself. In those situations, you might not feel physical pain. In those situations, physical escape might be difficult, and mental escape is the best that you can do to survive that moment. So it's a coping strategy of necessity. I sort of think about it as the fire extinguisher. Like it always says, in case of emergency, break glass. Dissociation is like that, where it is an emergency strategy if you've got nothing else that you can do. And that's a good way to think about it. It does its job in the moment. If dissociation then carries through the rest of your life afterwards, then it becomes very problematic, because you're actually safe. If those traumas aren't actually happening all over again, you're actually safe, but you're reacting as if you're not. Your body, your brain is reacting as if it's not. So there are a lot of emergency coping skills that people use when they have nothing else, that long-term are not so helpful. So I would say that, and also we know that dissociation at the time of a trauma predicts the development of PTSD. So people who have what we call peri-traumatic dissociation, which means they dissociate around the time of the trauma, right afterwards or during, are those that are more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, because they're not able to make memories of the event in a way that can make sense to them. Everything is really disjointed and scattered in their mind.
I think about children who've been sexually abused. And I've seen a number of them, and my experience has been you really can't get them. I'm not a counselor, but I've sent them, and I worked kind of with counselors trying to help them. Is that there's tremendous amount of denial all through even the teen years, and maybe it's shame, I don't know, but it's almost like they need the emotional depth or capacity to deal with the trauma, and that perhaps it's denial that keeps them safe until then. So what you're saying is if those children grow up into adults and never face that, that they are set up for continued dissociation or continued that peri-PTSD, whatever you said, later in life?
Yeah, so it's not exactly that. I guess what I would say is, well, first off, that childhood sexual abuse is probably, to my mind, and a lot of researchers and clinicians, one of the worst things that can happen to you as an individual, because it usually occurs by a family member or family friend, and so there's a violation of trust, and then there might be a family secret around it that makes it even worse. So there is betrayal element to it often, and it can leave lasting effects. And in that instance, I would think there's an element of dissociation. I would probably call it that rather than denial.
Okay.
And there's also I think, depending on the child, the developmental stage really impacts how they perceive it, how they make sense of it at the time, is based on their developmental age. It may be that they don't actually understand what's happening. They don't actually understand that what's happening is horribly wrong, that this person should not be touching them in that way, especially if it's a loved one or caretaker. And that realization might come with time, with age, with perspective, through talking to a therapist. They can understand the event in context and also understand that it wasn't their fault. So I think that that's another element of recovery from childhood abuse of any kind, particularly sexual abuse, is understanding that you are not to blame and that you're not responsible for the actions of the oftentimes fully grown adult.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about the brain. Because one of the wonderful things that I love about your book is that you go into the science of it. You don't just talk about experiences with patients and so forth, but you go into the science of it. And in particular, you go through different sections of the brain that I think are important for our listeners to know about and hear, because they are very much involved in resilience, the way the brain responds, maybe the way it acts in order to make you resilient. Can you just sort of briefly go through the major areas of your brain like you do in your book and talk about how they respond and how they're involved in resilience?
Yeah, I don't know if the listeners can see me smiling. I'm smiling because this could be a 3-hour conversation.
I know. Well, you need to come back. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I think the misconception is that any psychiatric disorder or any psychological experience is related to just one brain region. So it's, for example, not the case that anxiety disorders are just your amygdala going wild, your fear center going wild. It's much more complicated than that. But generally speaking, resilience involves the entire body and, to some extent, the entire brain. Some of the key areas that our research has shown are involved in resilience are the prefrontal cortex, so the area above your eyes. Think about what's behind your forehead. And those are areas of the brain that are related to thinking about problems flexibly, regulating your emotions, seeing perspectives, slowing yourself down, reminding yourself that you're safe, inhibiting some of the fear signals that you might be getting from other parts of your body. So that higher order thinking, that cognitive flexibility, is the prefrontal cortex. And sometimes in people with PTSD or different anxiety disorders, that activity is not as active as we would want it to be. So the inhibition, the stop switch on emotional signals is not there as effectively. And a lot of the interventions help you build up that flexibility, build up those skills. There are other areas like the hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved, sort of think about kind of deeper in your brain on the sides of your head. The hippocampus is involved in memory formation and especially autobiographical memories about your life. And of course, seeing your challenges in perspective of the rest of your life story requires the hippocampus to be functioning at its best. What we know, however, sometimes is that chronic stress can lead to changes in the hippocampus that are not so helpful for trauma recovery and for seeing things in perspective. So we want to work against some of those changes, which may not be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
And other areas like the amygdala, and the amygdala, I think, gets a bad rap as the fear center of the brain. As I said, it's
Yeah.
never that simple.
Mm-hmm.
It's never the case that this part of the brain only does this, and that's the one label for it. It's much more complicated. One way to think about the amygdala and some of its neighboring areas is what's called the salience network. There are parts of the brain, just like the amygdala, or including the amygdala, that tag things as important, that direct your attention to things. Say, pay attention to this. This is important. This has emotional significance. Tagging things as emotionally significant is part of what the amygdala does. And yes, it's implicated in fear and fear memories, and quieting the amygdala in some cases is very helpful for resilience. Learning skills like deep breathing sort of quiets down those signals. But it's not just the amygdala that's the culprit. It's really the whole body and other parts of the brain. So those are some of the areas. There's also areas like the insula, which is related to body awareness. And people who have PTSD, especially if they dissociate or space out, might have alterations in how that area of the brain activates and functions. And so they might be more apt to feel out of their body more of the time. Or they might, in cases of panic disorder, catastrophically misinterpret a bodily sensation as a sign of a heart attack. Yeah. Oh no, I'm feeling this tension in my chest, and oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. There's a misinterpretation. Some of that body awareness is related to the function of the insula, among other areas. So like having a really good sense of your body and what signals and what different emotions feel like is really, really important for resilience and recovery.
Yep. I'm so grateful that you talk about this and that you explain this, and you go into much more detail in your book. So that's why people have to read the book. But so often when there are psychological issues, emotional issues in children, a lot of parents and their friends will say, no, this is not really physiology. They just need to pray. They just need to think it differently. This isn't really real. It is real. And there are body changes. There are brain changes. We have neurochemicals. So understanding that, and you talk about the different changes, can a good therapist actually change the function of these or utilize the function of these different parts of your brain to heal you? And will the brain change?
Yes, absolutely. We know, especially the brains of kids, you've probably seen in your work, kids can have devastating physical injuries. And in many cases, maybe not all, but many cases can have pretty good function afterwards, after what for an adult might be a devastating, or an older person might be a devastating, permanently debilitating injury. Kids can recover from, because the brain is malleable. It becomes a little less malleable after, as we get older, but the brain is malleable. So, biology, what we're born with is not destiny. And the brain can change. Our research, many decades of research, does show that therapy, cognitive behavior therapy in particular, and other therapies change brain networks. So for someone with depression or anxiety, the brain networks implicated in that can shift can change as a result of good therapy. Some similar changes are seen with medications. There's been a lot of excitement about medications for PTSD and depression lately that have been in the news that change the brain. And just as you were saying, it's really important that there's this maybe false distinction between physical health conditions and mental health conditions. These mental health conditions have a brain and body basis.
Yes.
We can see evidence of PTSD in the brain. We can see evidence of PTSD in bodily responses to situations. Those are not definitionally permanent. And I think that's the really turning point here. I really want to emphasize that understanding that mental health conditions can impact the brain and the body, and understanding that trauma can have an impact on the brain and the body is very helpful and destigmatizing. And it's good to have that understanding as a basis for intervention and the way you frame your experiences. But that does not mean that you're permanently scarred. It does not mean that it leaves a permanent mark on you that will never go away. There are very good interventions that help shift some of the impact or mitigate some of the impact. But it requires effort and investment. And it certainly, like, services need to be available, and more services need to be available these days for, the challenges society is facing. But these changes that happen in the brain as a result of our experiences can shift. And there's hope in that.
Well, and it kind of circles back to what we were talking at the beginning. I think that if you're a parent or you're an adult who is suffering from depression or whatever, and you don't believe there's physiology in there, and you don't believe there are brain changes, and you're afraid to see that. For instance, I hear, kids are suicidal, and I'll talk to them, and their psychiatrist or counselor, psychologist thinks they need antidepressants, and a parent will say, no, that's going to ruin my child's brain. And I say, it's really very much like giving insulin to a diabetic. If your child's sugars are all over the place, that there's a malfunction in the pancreas. So let's correct that. But a lot of people, when it comes to mental illness or PTSD or things that are thought related, can't conceive that actually there's physiology. And so I love that you reinforce that, because if you don't face that, you can't heal from it. If you don't believe there are brain changes, how in the world can you allow someone to help you shift those back to a normal and a healthy place? Do you find much resistance that patients have in facing the fact that there's physiology involved?
I think in some cases, I worked for many years with 9/11 first responders, and there's a lot of mental health stigma, especially in men within that population. Worked with retired police officers and EMT workers and volunteers, construction workers, and there's got to be tough, and I'll just power through and be stoic, and everything will be fine, and it will all go away, or I can, just turn to my beer at the end of the day, and things will be better. And that only gets you so far. And while I'm not a child psychiatrist, and there are many instances where medications actually save someone's life. I've seen this happen.
I have too.
Where,
yeah.
And, heavens know what would happen if that intervention was not timely and did not take place, because medications can help stabilize some of the brain networks, can help people be more receptive to therapeutic interventions. If they're so depressed that they can't get out of bed and see no escape, the medications might help them feel a little bit more energized and actually show up to therapy, show up to school, show up to their social group. Think about things more flexibly, other than the only answer is suicide.
Yeah. Thank you. People will listen to you and they won't listen to me because I'm a medical doctor, and they think, well, all you want to do is sort of change biology. No. It's the body is so complex and everything is related. Your spirit and your mind and your body are so intertwined. You really can't pull one apart from the other. We are out of time. Your book is fabulous. I love it. I think it's just not only interesting, but it offers very concrete tools and understanding for parents who want to help their kids learn to be resilient. And there's no more critical time in history, I believe, than now, and to learn to help our kids. The book is Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. And we are facing some of those greatest challenges right now. And Dr. DePierro, I thank you so much for coming